Ladies and gentlemen, we are very glad that all of you have joined us here tonight. We have just completed a very interesting session with our guest speaker tonight, Professor Snyder, and I know all of you look forward to hearing what he has to say. But as many of you may know, this is not only an associate's dinner tonight, this is also the presentation of the first biennial Memorial Daniel Holland Memorial Lecture. And tonight we honor his memory, an outstanding student at the University of Oklahoma. Daniel was a gifted and dedicated student, beloved by so many. He was a National Merit Scholar, an honors student. He had been selected as an outstanding freshman and a leadership scholar. He was a student leader of many groups on campus, especially Crimson Club. He was a member of the Society of Fellows of our Institute on America's Constitutional Heritage. He was selected as a scholar by the Carl Albert Center. And as some of you know, he tragically lost his life while studying abroad in a swimming accident. But he was an incredible student and an incredible leader on our campus. And at the time of his death, I had the privilege of attending his memorial service and hearing so many of his fellow students speak about him and share their experiences about him. He was not only a gifted student, he worked outside of this campus to improve the broader society. He interned for the State Senate. He served as president of the OU Rotary program, and he was a consultant to the nonprofit group, the Oklahoma Group, and served as vice president also of OU's College Young Democrats. He was committed to bringing justice in our society and righting wrongs and making this a better place to live. He represented the best of the ideals of our students and the best of academic achievement by our students. You know, sometimes I think we feel we have to live long lives to have an impact on society. And listening that day as one after another student described the impact that Daniel Holland had had on their life, I realized it's not a matter of how long we live, it's how we live and how we spend our influence and how we spend our time. And he certainly left an incredible, indelible mark on so many. I remember one student who said, because he lived, we all feel the obligation to carry on his values. We feel the obligation to be his voice and for it to continue to speak on behalf of our generation. We feel the obligation to be his feet as we go about doing the work in the world that we know that he would want us to continue to do. What a wonderful legacy. What a wonderful legacy Daniel Holland has left at the University of Oklahoma. So tonight we remember him as we observe the giving of the first biennial Holland Memorial Lecture. We have members of his family here with us tonight, and I know that you would want to greet them and thank them for the great gift that they have given through Daniel to the University of Oklahoma family, for the impact that he's had upon all of us who cherish his memory and want to continue to live by his values. So I would like to ask them to come forward at this time. The Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma has voted to posthumously award the degrees for which he worked at the University of Oklahoma. He would have been graduating this year with a BA in International and Area Studies from the College of International Studies and a BA in Letters from the College of Arts and Sciences, all with honors. He left an incredible mark on this university, and please join me in letting us express our appreciation to his family as they come forward and receive his degrees. Thank you very much. We are so glad to have Marina Holland with us, Daniel's mother, Father Sarah from Holland, his father, and his sister, who's also a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, Christina Holland McFadden. Thank you all for joining with us in the celebration of his life tonight as we continue to have an impact by him of the values by which he lived. As I said, we're really glad to have all of you here with us tonight. It's a small world. I was visiting with our speaker tonight, and as we were visiting, we found out that we belonged to the same residential college at Oxford University, Balliol College, which modestly asserted in its motto, effortless superiority, which gives you an indication of the self-image that members of the college had of themselves, and perhaps an overabundant, or maybe a lack of humility, I might say. But anyway, that was a wonderful thing to hear that we shared that. I want to we'll introduce Professor Snyder appropriately later on, but you know, I've learned that all good things ultimately have a connection to Oklahoma and to Norman. And so his sister-in-law, Lori Anderson Snyder, has been a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma. His brother, Michael Snyder, did graduate work, and they both live here at the in Norman, Oklahoma. And also his nieces, Cora Snyder and Ivy Snyder, are here. The Snyder family, would you stand and let us recognize you? We're very glad that all of you are here. You're all our special guests, but I haven't gotten to see them yet, but I'm told that State Representative Kevin McDougall is here tonight, and State Representative Colin Walke is here tonight. Are they here? Or are they still in the state capitol? Anyway, are they here? No, I don't see them. But they will probably be joining us later. I do know that the action at the state capitol, the labor action, has been discontinued as of today, and I can simply say I hope that we can find a way to take action so that our teachers will not find it necessary to take these kinds of actions to get the attention of our public officials so that they can have a living wage, people who are how lucky we are that they are giving of themselves to touch the next generation of Oklahomans, and how much all of us can think about the difference that great teachers have made in our lives and they continue to make in the lives of our children and grandchildren. There's simply no higher calling, and we all wish them well in the efforts that they began. And speaking of that, I'd like to welcome the president of the OU Student Government Association, who I think provide the kind of leadership we need to have in our state in the future. Yassine Sherbaji, would you please stand? Yassine, would you stand? I think he's here. President of the student body. Well, he may be studying. He was just with us earlier today. Wonderful things are happening at the University of Oklahoma, and you know, I can't allow a dinner like this to take place without mentioning a few of them. Some of you know, many of you have heard so many times, and you see it always at the beginning of the football season when we have our National Merit Scholars stand out on the football field and be honored by the crowd. But this, and we have for the first time, as you know, for the first time in U.S. history, a public university enrolled more National Merit Scholars than any other university in the United States, any private university in the United States, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, University of Oklahoma. And in the year in which that happened, we had 281 freshman National Merit Scholars at the University of Oklahoma. Well, the figures are in for this year. We had 317 National Merit Scholars enrolled as freshmen at the University of Oklahoma. And so now for the second year in a row, a public university has been ranked #1 in the entire country in terms of the number of those scholars that have been enrolled. So many great things have happened. The number of our students studying abroad went up by almost 200 again this year. We've had, you've heard me say before, we have moved from 2% of our students studying abroad to over a third of our students studying abroad. And we again joined only 30 other public institutions in the country in having our freshman retention rate exceed 90%, and this year we exceeded 92%. So the progress is still going. There's so many things. So many things for which to be grateful. But enjoy dinner together. We've had a very provocative discussion. I'm sorry for us running a little bit late. It's a sign of the kind of interest that our guest speaker draws and the topic about which he is speaking that's important to all of us and important for all of us to think about. So please enjoy your dinner together. We're glad that you're here. You know, one of the great things about these associates' dinners over time, as I look back on them, has been the fact that we have talked about things that really matter to all of us, important questions for our times, and that we have had guest speakers here who have joined us, who have further caused us to think and to think more deeply about these issues which are important to the future of our society, important to the future of our university, and indeed important to the future of our country. This is no exception tonight. The first time that we had a chance to pick up the little book On Tyranny by Tim Snyder, it immediately caused a huge amount of discussion between Molly and myself. You know, I don't know how many of you thought about what's going on in the world today and how in many ways it reflects what went on in the world prior to World War I. But a lot of the parallels are disturbing. A few years ago, Molly and I had the chance to go to Eastern Europe shortly after Soviet occupation ended. And it was so uplifting and so inspiring to see the high hopes that people had in countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, how much they were celebrating their newfound freedom and glorying in it. One of the most touching moments to us that we'll always remember is being in Prague, walking near the cathedral, and we heard a lone person sitting on a bench near the cathedral, and he was playing on his harmonica, "We Shall Overcome," in celebration of the newfound spirit of freedom in that country. And it was a wonderful experience and a heartwarming experience, and it made you feel so optimistic about the future of the world and where we were going and what human beings had accomplished. And then to pick up the discussion section in one of our leading newspapers this weekend and to read articles about the return of fascism, threats to democracy, disillusionment with democracy in places like Poland, where we were all inspired by Lech Walesa and the shipyard uprising, to think that that could happen. To think that it could happen in countries like Hungary and to see what is taking place, the threats to democracy. It's unthinkable, but it raises so many questions. How could this happen? How could the march toward democracy and embracing of democracy come under such a threat? How could it be reversed? And one of the things I always felt as a student in reading history was I'm trying to understand how a society as strong and as vibrant as German society was in so many ways, as rich as it was in its political life and its artistic life, how could it have been transformed from a democracy into a dictatorship, and one of the most cruel dictatorships that has ever existed, with the destruction of so many innocent lives? How could a society that had been strong and vibrant produce the Nazi movement and a Hitler in power? How did it happen? And of course, you can't read the history of that period, and you can't read German history of that period without asking yourself the question, could it ever happen here? Could our strong and vibrant and free society ever be transformed in that way? And if so, how could it happen? Well, our speaker tonight really confronts us with those kinds of questions as he has probed the history of Europe during the period before World War II, but the period between the wars. He's written in such a provocative way that he makes it impossible for us to avoid the question, what is it about societies? And are we exempt somehow? Are we some special people who are not as other people, other human beings throughout world history have been, prone to the same kind of absence of democracy and totalitarianism as others? He is an international best-selling author. He's one of America's leading historians and public intellectuals. He's perhaps even better known in Europe than he is in the United States. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale and a permanent fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford, where he was a British Marshall Scholar. Before joining the faculty at Yale in 2001, he had fellowships in Paris, Vienna, and Warsaw, and was an Academy Scholar at Harvard. He speaks 5 languages and reads 10 languages. He has been published in many different languages. He has authored 6 award-winning books. His most recent book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, appeared in the United States in February and is now available all around the world. Just last week, his newest book, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America, was released. His scholarly articles have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, among many others. He writes often for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the International Herald Tribune. He was a recipient of the inaugural Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2015, as well as the Havel Foundation Prize. He's a recipient of the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. He's also a member of the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of Modern History and East European Politics and Societies. He is a teacher both of graduates and undergraduate students at Yale University, and how lucky they are to have such a stimulating person in their presence and as part of their lives. It's a real honor to introduce to you at this time Professor Timothy Snyder. Tim?
Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. Thank you also for the tie that I'm wearing. Yeah, right? When I arrived in my hotel room this afternoon, it was waiting for me, which, and I'm not that socially apt, but I figured that was some kind of a hint. So I took it. The way I'd like to spend some time together with all of you this evening is to speak about the question of what freedom actually is. President Bourne has kindly introduced me by mentioning a couple of themes about which I write and about which I speak, and to which I'll be very happy to return in questions and answers, but which I'd just like to use as an introduction here. The first point that Professor Bourne made implicitly, which is very important, is freedom here is freedom everywhere. The story of Hungary and Poland is also our story. Hungary and Poland move one way, partly because we're moving one way. Hungary and Poland move another way, partly because we're moving another way. It's impossible to isolate American history and American politics from the rest of the world. Much as we might like to think that we can build a wall or put ourselves first, everything that we do, whether we like it or not, has consequences. Rulers around the world take their cues from us, whether we like it or not. One of the things I've become most profoundly convinced of in the last year, watching the United States from the rest of the world and watching the rest of the world from the United States, is that you can't push the pause button. Either democracy is advancing or democracy is retreating. You can't take a moment and say, we need to fix a few things at home now. We need a break. It doesn't work like that. The moment that you're not pressing forward with democracy at home, democracy will also start to retreat abroad. That's just the way things work. The second point that Professor Bourne suggested, which I think is extremely important to address, and I'll address it quickly, is, can it happen here? Yes. Yes, of course it can happen here. And the very reasons why we think it can't happen here actually make it more likely. We, as American nationalists, have a tendency to think precisely that we're exceptional. And that moment when we're thinking about how we're exceptional is the moment when we're not thinking about how we are vulnerable. I spend much of my mental life with those Jews and those Germans of the 1930s, or with those Soviet citizens, perpetrators and victims of the 1930s. Those people are not so very different from us. The question, can it happen here, always strikes me as very strange, because the differences between here and there and us and them aren't as great as we think. Or to put the point more strongly, when there are differences, they're not always to our benefit. Do we really think we have a better attention span than Germans in the 1930s? Do we really think we're more literate than Germans in the 1930s? Do we think we know more about the world than Germans in the 1930s? Right? The answer to all those questions is no. So, can it happen here? Of course it can happen here. And the it that is happening, for better or worse, is not here or there. It's everywhere, all the time. Whether we see this or not, the United States has lost its reputation as a champion of human rights and democracy. Looked at from the rest of the world, we no longer stand for those things, which, given what I've just said, raises the question, which will be the subject of my talk: what would it mean to stand for those things? What does it mean to be a free country? What actually is this freedom of which we speak so much? One of my worries about ourselves is that in speaking the word freedom so very often, we dodge the question or don't raise the question at all of what we actually have in mind by being free. So this is the subject of my talk this evening. The title of my talk is "What is Essential is Invisible to the Eye: Some Questions and Answers about American Freedom." And as some of you will know, "What is Essential is Invisible to the Eye" is a quotation from the book The Little Prince, which was a book that Daniel Holland very much liked. So let me begin this question. What does it mean to be free? To be free has to do with the unexpected, the element of the unexpected. I would say even the mysterious and the magical. If the people who know you know what you're going to do all of the time, if you yourself know what you're going to do all of the time, it seems unlikely to me that you're free. If you are afraid of the same things as the people who are like you, by age, by race, by culture, it's unlikely that you're free. It's normal to be afraid. It's not normal to be afraid of the same things at the same time as everyone else. If we're afraid of the same things at the same time as everyone else, it's very possible that rather than being free, we're being manipulated. It seems to me, and this is where I'd like to begin, that to be free involves having a world inside you that's different from the world outside. A world inside you which is better or at least different than the world outside. If you have no such world inside you that's different, how can you change the world outside? And if you're not changing the world outside, how can you be free? If you don't have just a little bit of vision and a little bit of power to change the world outside, I don't think it's very likely that you're free. If you can't imagine difference, it's very hard, I think, to be free. And this is the first lesson of the book that Professor Bourne very kindly mentioned, and I'll mention it only once myself. You don't obey in advance. Don't obey in advance means you have a world inside you which tells you when something just isn't right, when things are going the wrong way, when you will be willing not to just adjust to everything, but to do something slightly different. If you have no world inside you, then everything that happens outside is always normal, and you will always adjust to it. And that way lies authoritarianism, always. So, you might say about freedom, and a lot of Americans say this, you might say about freedom, well, look, here I am, here's the world. My freedom consists in the fact that I choose things from the world. I am the way I am. The world is the way it is. I like certain things. I don't like certain things. I buy certain things. I don't buy certain things. I make decisions. I make choices. Surely that's enough to be free. But I think this misses some very important questions, like, what are you and what is the world? If you say, I'm just someone who has economic interests or economic preferences, and the world is just a kind of giant store from which I take things, is that really a sufficient answer? Isn't that just taking someone else's description of the world and making it your own? And if the idea of freedom is that I know who I am, I know what the world is, I like some things, I don't like others, where are other people in that vision? It seems to me that if the idea of freedom is I simply take the things that I want, that's not actually called freedom. That's called irresponsibility. And if your idea of freedom is that I'm going to take things and other people are going to take things, who are those other people in that vision? Aren't they just things? I think freedom has to involve freedom for everybody, which means we all have to be able to see ourselves somehow together in the world, or more strongly, for one another in the world. So in this little book, The Little Prince, this little book, The Little Prince, what we have is a kind of account of how people might be free, one to another, one with another, and along the world. I'm very happy to be speaking to you on this subject and about this book, remembering Daniel Holland. I'm very happy to be in the company of his family, Christina, Marina, Father Serafim, and I'm very happy to be in the company of his friends. And what I'd like to try to do is to read the book in a way that helps us to answer this question about what freedom actually is. Now, I think this book in particular And I will now make an unbelievably old-fashioned and conservative move. Watch. Books in general have an awful lot to do with freedom, have a very close connection to freedom itself. I think books are a way of being together while being individual at the same time, and that books are a way of learning without even realizing that you're learning, to see a world as being different than it is. I think The Little Prince does this particularly well, but I think all books do it. So, to put it a different way, I think books are gifts, not just of the author. We don't have to all write books. It's probably a good thing that we don't all write books. But books are gifts from one of us to others when we recommend books, when we come across books. In this sense, this event was a gift to me, right? And in this sense, Daniel Holland made a gift to me, because I thought, when I was thinking about this lecture, I thought I had read The Little Prince. I thought I had read it. But when I picked it up to read it, I realized, no, I had read a children's version of it at some point. And then in the bedroom of the house where Michael and I grew up, we had a framed picture of the Little Prince with his friend the fox, with the quotation, precisely the quotation, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." And so it was familiar to me, but I realized I hadn't read it. So I read it for the first time. And this is a kind of gift, right? And this is, in a way, what I mean by freedom. It has to do with something accidental sometimes. You meet someone in a serendipitous way, even someone who is in a very different place, as in this case. You meet someone, you run across someone in an accidental and surprising way, and yet the book is there to bring you together in a way which no one could have foreseen, right? This, I think, has something essential to do with freedom, because it gives us something in common, which is at the same time our own. Every reading of a book is different. Your reading and my reading of The Little Prince will be different. And yet the book is something that we have in common, all the same. The words are there for us, all the same. And of course, when we read books, we then have something in common, at least with the author. So the author of The Little Prince was a French pilot called Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And so now the three of us, Daniel Holland, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and I, and any of you who read the book after this lecture, or any of you who have read the book before this lecture, we all have something in common. Any book does that. Now, what I want to suggest along the way is that books do something that other kinds of media don't. So I want to contrast the book very briefly with this thing that you may have heard of called the internet, which is chiefly a way that middle-aged people unwillingly hemorrhage data. But I understand that it may have other uses, but that seems to be the main one. The internet works very differently. This place where we spend so much time works very differently. It seems to reveal things to us, but what it's revealing to us is often just how much it knows about us. If each of us performs the search for the same item, let's say we all go on Google right now, and please don't do it right now, okay? Stay with me, I need you. If we all go on Google right now and search for The Little Prince, we'll all get different answers, because Google thinks it knows what you want. And so the internet doesn't bring us together, even about this most elementary way. More, Google seems to reveal things, and not just Google, I shouldn't pick on Google, Facebook, the internet, whatever. It seems to reveal things, and often it reveals all too much. The vulgar, right? The disgusting, the things that are too direct. And yet somehow, unlike books, it never seems to actually get us to the mystery, right? What Google or what the internet or what Facebook does is that it makes us more the way we already were. More the way we already were. It helps us think the thoughts that we've already thought and feel the feelings that we've already felt, which is not freedom and which is not bringing us close to anyone else. I would say it's not even bringing us closer to ourselves. I think it makes us less free. So, to repeat, to be free, if to be free is to be able to see the world differently than it is, so that you can change it, that means to be free means having a world inside yourself that's different from the world outside. How do you get that? Through books, through words. It's very hard to think without words or without pictures from other forms of art. It's very hard to have unexpected reactions to things without a head that's full of books. Or if you have an unexpected reaction, you don't know how to articulate it because you don't have the words for it. And if you don't have the words for it, then you can't share it with anyone else. And if you can't share it with someone else, then you're not free. Because if you can't share it with someone else, that image, that feeling you're having, isn't changing the world. It's just circulating back to you. And if you're not changing the world, then you're not free. So, what about this particular story? All of that was about books in general, but what about this particular story? What is the story of the Little Prince? Here's the story. So, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was in fact a pilot, tells the story in this book, which was published in 1943 during the Second World War. He tells the story of crash landing in a desert and being marooned in this desert for 8 days. And the situation is that he's in the middle of the desert. There's no one else around. He has just a few days to try to repair his airplane. He has to repair the motor of his airplane. He doesn't have enough water. So he's in a very critical situation. So as he is in the middle of the desert with very little water, trying to carry out a technical task for which he's not really qualified, a small boy or a person that looks like a small boy appears out of nowhere next to him and starts to talk to him. And this small boy, this little prince, turns out to have a very interesting story to tell. A story about his own planet and other planets he's visited, and a story about the Earth. But before I tell you that story, I want to note something which has just happened. You haven't had any trouble listening to stories within stories. Except for the person with the phone. You haven't had any trouble with something which is about human freedom. I'm telling you a story about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry telling a story, about the Little Prince telling a story, and it's very easy for all of you to follow, right? That's normal, and that's part of what freedom is like. When you assimilate multiple points of view all at the same time, when you realize there's a story about a story about a story, and your mind just takes it in naturally, that's one way of being free. And it's oh so different from having the internet just pound back through your eyes the things that you're putting in through the keyboard. And yet we can do it. We can do it very easily. And if I tell you the strange story that the Little Prince tells inside the story, we can all follow it very easily. It's not difficult at all. So if I say, imagine a little prince, about the size of my 8-year-old, say, imagine a little prince who lives on an asteroid and who gardens and who has 3 volcanoes, one of which is extinct. And he gardens, he tends to those volcanoes. Imagine a little prince who has a flower. We would call it a rose, but as far as he knows, it's the only flower of its kind. And imagine Little Prince falls in love with the rose. But the rose is difficult, right? The rose is opinionated. The rose is inconsistent. The rose has particular needs. The rose is a bit capricious. And the Little Prince doesn't always know how to talk to her. They have disagreements. And the disagreement ends, as such disagreements sometimes do, with the Little Prince deciding that he's going to leave his asteroid and visit other planets. Isn't it remarkable that I can just say those words and you can just imagine what I'm saying? Isn't that remarkable? And isn't that unpredictable? You didn't know I was going to talk about asteroids or a rose or of tending volcanoes, and yet we can do it together. We can do it together unpredictably. It's a tiny, tiny bit of what freedom is like. On this journey, the little prince, the story now becomes like a parable. On this journey, the little prince stops at a series of planets. And on this series of planets, there is a grown-up. In the story, it's called a big person, un grand personne. There's a grown-up on each planet. There is, for example, a vain man, a man who is very vain, who sees everyone else as admirers. There is a geographer. I particularly like this one. A geographer who is not an explorer, but a geographer. So he only sits behind a desk and waits for the explorers to come. And you have to imagine the desk is on a planet, and there's nothing else on the planet except the geographer and his blank book, which he's waiting to fill up when the explorers come. But he doesn't believe what the explorers tell him because he can't verify it himself. Right? Then you have the drinker, who does nothing but drink, and he drinks because he's ashamed of drinking. You also have the businessman who counts the stars and says, since I was the first one to think of counting the stars belong to me. Now, all of these men have one thing in common, as the little prince says, which is that they think they're free, but they're not. They think they're free, but they're not. They're all alone. They have no one with them, and they're not really changing the world. They think they're free, but in fact, they're very much alone. And of course, in each of these figures, or from each of these figures, we can draw out a slightly larger idea, maybe one which hits a little bit closer to home, about what unfreedom is like, what the absence of freedom is like. So let's take the drinker first. The drinker is caught in a cycle. The drinking is stronger than him. Is it right to say that he wants to drink? Is it right to say that we want that next potato chip when the bag is open in front of us? Is it right to say that we wanted to spend those 3 extra hours on the internet? Is it right to say that people want to take opioids? Or are these kinds of cycles of behavior, although they implicate desire, are they really about not being free at all? Or take the geographer. Think about the geographer. The geographer sits alone. He doesn't investigate anything himself. He wants all knowledge brought to him. And then when it comes, he's doubtful of everything. What an interesting posture. Isn't it just a bit like some of us who spend time at the internet and spend so much time at the internet that we don't really believe in anything? We doubt it all, and we think we're being advanced or radical or cool when we say, I don't believe that, I don't believe this, I'm skeptical of everything. And yet we never leave our own little planet and go out and investigate anything ourselves. Isn't that telling? Isn't that a way that perhaps we are unfree? The vain man. I don't have to do it, do I? To be vain is to be empty. To be vain is to be unable to see the other person. To be vain is to be unfree and to set an example of unfreedom for others. The businessman in this story, he owns the stars because he saw the stars first. He counts them over and over and over again. He turns the quality of the stars into quantity, but he can't turn it back into quality. It's numbers over and over and over again. He has no human language at all. He can only speak of ownership. This businessman Not all businessmen, of course. Not nice businessmen who give money to the humanities. But this businessman, this parable of this businessman can hit pretty close to home too. When we count the wealth of America, we can say America is a much wealthier country than it was in 1980. It is, if we count all the wealth. But 90% of the citizens of this country have gained neither wealth nor income since 1980. 90%. We can count many of our achievements, but the ways that we count sometimes allow us to overlook the way that individual people count. That we have a very unequal society is revealed by those individuals, let's say, several thousand Americans who have been evicted from their apartments while I'm giving this lecture. Or statistically speaking, the 3 or 4 American veterans of military service who will have committed suicide during this evening. Roughly 20 American military veterans commit suicide every day. Those are things which we could count, but which we don't. We need a human language to see all of these things. So we're free to drink, free to doubt, free to preen, free to accumulate. But the Little Prince is suggesting to us that these things are not freedom. The final encounter that matters to the Little Prince takes place on earth, and it's with a fox, the little fox that Saint-Exupéry draws with the ears that are too big. And the fox has a couple of very interesting things to say. The fox says, if you want to see someone as a person, you have to recognize them and care for them. If you don't, you look out into a crowd and you see 1,000 people, and they're just 1,000 people. But the moment that you begin to take care of one of them or to recognize one of them, then they become an individual. And the fox also says, that's when you become an individual. The moment that you see something different in someone else and begin to recognize it and care for it is also the moment that you become an individual. If you look out and you see just 1,000 people, or as the fox might say, 1,000 chickens, if you look out and see 1,000 people, you're not seeing anything, and then you're not becoming anything yourself. And the fox goes further. He says, when you are able to see what is different about someone else, and when that enters you, that other person gains this very special power. That other person helps you to enchant the world. You then begin to see the world differently because you have that other person in your life. And then there is that element of the unexpected or the mysterious or even the magical that we might associate with freedom. But the fox is saying, you can't do it on your own. You can only do it when you accept someone else, when you make someone else a friend, or when you love someone else. And this is where the fox says this is his favorite thing. Here is my secret. It's very simple. You can't see well except with the heart. The essential is invisible to the eyes. What does he mean exactly by that? He means that the essential is the enchantment of the world. The way the world actually comes to life, it takes on color, it takes on mystery, because we're seeing it through someone else's eyes. And seeing it through someone else's eyes is the thing that allows us to start to become what we might become, that is to say, an individual. The little prince had been in despair because before he saw the fox, he had walked through a rose garden and he had realized, my rose is not unique. She's not the only one. There are 1,000 other roses just like her. But after he spoke to the fox, he understood that my rose is not like all the other roses because I take care of my rose, because I see in my rose something which is special. She's different from all the other ones. She is unique because I love her. So, the fox continues, once you are taking care of something, once you love something, then you are responsible for that something. And this word responsible, right, responsibility, is a very heavy word for what might have seemed to be a children's book. This word responsibility, you become always responsible for what you recognize, for what you care of. But it's this sense of responsibility which means being free with someone else. Free yourself, but also free to see the world, or in the book, the universe in a certain way. So at this moment in the story, the little prince looks up and he's looking for his own world. And when you look at the sky, of course, the stars look more or less alike. But his star is different because she is there, right? The whole universe, the whole field of stars is enchanted because his one star is enchanted. And it's enchanted because she is there. And she's enchanted because he has recognized her. And in that way, his world, you see, we're talking about the whole world. In this way, his world is different from everyone else's world, right? His world is different from everyone else's world. And in that way, I think it's right to say he's free. At the end of the book, the little prince dies, or seems to. And in his last conversation with the narrator, with this pilot, he reiterates this lesson. He goes through this all again. He says, it may seem as though I'm dying, as though I'm passing away. But because I have talked to you the way that I've talked to you, because you know my planet is up there, you will always see the world in a different way. You will always look up at the stars and smile. You will always look up at the stars and laugh. Because of this friendship, the world is enchanted. Because of this strange encounter, the people who have the encounter, the person who lives through the encounter, is different. What does this have to do with politics? I think everything. I think this has everything to do with politics. It's pretty easy, at least I think it's pretty easy, to diagnose what's going wrong. This is what The Road to Unfreedom, the book that President Boren kindly mentioned, does. It's not even that difficult to suggest some practical steps that we might take, which is what I try to do in On Tyranny. I think the hardest thing, but also the most essential thing, is to know what it is that you're actually defending, where defending actually has to mean producing. Freedom is not a thing like a rock or a wall that you can defend like a thing. Freedom is something that you have more of or you have less of. And if you have more of it, then everyone's going to have more of it. If you have less of it, everyone's going to have less. So where I'm going to close is with this thought. What art does, books, but art in general, is that art makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange, right? It makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And that ability to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange is the ability that we have to have if we're going to engage with other people whose lives are different than ours. And it's the ability that we have to have along with them if we're going to enchant the world together. Where by enchant, I don't mean anything mystical. What I mean by enchant is just to see the world as different than it is. Because if you can see it as different than it is, there's some chance that you can push it in that direction. If you can't see it as different than it is, then you can't make it any different than it is. I'll push this further, if you can't enchant the world, it's hard to know what it means to be living in the world. And it's hard to imagine a world that's worth dying for, or something that's worth dying for, if you don't have a vision of just what is good or just what it means to be better. This is apparently a book about childhood, but it's certainly not a book about immaturity. I think it's rather a book about how we might preserve what children have into maturity. My son Caleb, who just turned 8, announced that, let me get his quotation correct, "Only children discover the world. Grown-ups are just their guides." And in this book, in The Little Prince, all of the adults are in fact unfree, except perhaps the narrator. The adults are in fact unfree. But it's not a book about remaining a child. That's not the solution. It's about, I think, a book about retaining a sense of mystery in a world which is in fact very complex. I think it's a book which is about the most serious thing, which is how to be free. And it was written, by the way, not by a whimsical person. Saint-Exupéry's other novel, which I had in fact read, Vol de Nuit, Flight During the Nighttime, is about being a pilot and the risks that one takes when one flies in heavy weather. And it's fundamentally about a sense of duty. The Little Prince was written in 1943, as I said. Not very many months after it was written, Saint-Exupéry was shot down flying a Spitfire by a German ace over Marseille. He was flying a combat mission in the Second World War. So this book that I'm discussing was written by somebody who was as in the world of modernity and high technology and in the world of the greatest actual clash that has ever happened, in those worlds as much as one could possibly be. So where I would close in this particular setting is just to say this, that this particular setting is where I wanted to be able to say this, because it seems to me that the university is where we're going to succeed or where we're going to fail. The schools, and in the last ditch, the universities. But by we, I mean teachers and students. It seems that the university, and this is a thought that I get from what I read and from the little that I could learn about Daniel Holland, that the universities are a place to be free, not free from things, which is such a simple and inadequate idea of freedom, but free with other people, to enchant the world, to see the world as a bit different than it is, so that maybe we can make it a bit different than it is. And that within within universities, it's precisely the state universities and precisely the humanities within the state universities that give us a chance. It's very nice to be from a place like Yale, but Yale could exist or not exist. The state universities are not just the mind, they're the spinal cord of this country. Without the state universities, without their specific task of preserving some of the mystery of youth, right? Preserving some of the mystery of childhood and bringing it into the complexity of the world that we have to face, I don't think our country is going to make it. So there are a lot of things that one could say about freedom and unfreedom. I've chosen to close on the university because the university, like this book, is something which some of us here share. But my larger point is this: for all that we can complain about the kinds of authoritarianism that are coming from abroad or arising at home, and for all that we could and should think about what we're going to do about it, what we have before us is an occasion really to think about what it means to be free. And I think without that, without a robust, real, positive sense, without a sense of freedom that might seem a little bit naive, right? That might seem a little childish, without a sense of freedom that's expansive, which isn't just about me or just about you, but which is about us. Without that, it's not clear why we would ever worry. What are we worried about? It's not clear why we would ever act. What are we acting for? What are we acting for? I've given you my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those thoughtful remarks. And now we'll open questions. We have Crimson Clumbers coming around with microphones, as you can see them there in their blazers. And so if anyone has a question, hope you would raise your hand and ask the question. Father Holland.
I'm Daniel's dad, and this is my wife, and this is my daughter, Christina. I want to thank you for the unexpected. I expected a political talk, and I heard really wonderful philosophy. And we found out about the Little Prince from a picture that Daniel was holding it in France, and he probably died 9 days later or whatever. And Little Prince came back with his effects. We bought many copies, and we've all read it probably 2 or 3 times at least. So I thank you for, that's really wonderful, a great gift to us. There's another character that you didn't talk about, and I know that you can only talk about so much, the lamplighter. The lamplighter was free. So perhaps I should ask a question. I'm actually just making a statement. But maybe you could talk about the lamplighter. He had purpose, he had obedience, he cared about others. It looked like he was doing something that was nonsensical, but he was completely obedient, and he was the freest of them all.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your kind word. I wanted to take this talk as an opportunity to think as deeply as I could about the things that matter the most, and I appreciate your family giving me this opportunity to do so. In the story of the Little Prince, there are 2 parables that I didn't mention, or 2 encounters that I didn't mention. The first was with the king, and the king is entirely self-absorbed, but he's still nevertheless a bit sympathetic, because the king, so the vain man greets everyone as an admirer, and the king greets everyone as a subject, which, so of course he's totally self-absorbed, but there's also something kind of pleasing about him, which is that he only issues orders that he regards as reasonable. In other words, orders which you would fulfill anyway. And so there's a certain pleasant hook around the king, which makes him less subject to the kind of use that I was putting him. And the lamplighter is interesting as well, because the lamplighter is the one that the Little Prince feels the most warmly towards, as you say. And the lamplighter is, so the story of the lamplighter is that he lights and extinguishes a lamp when it's dark. But his problem is that his planet is very small, and so he's constantly turning the light on and off, on and off, on and off. Or maybe it's rotating faster than it used to. But in any event, like now, a job that had been a reasonable job, he now is constantly turning the light on and off, on and off, on and off. And I didn't talk about him because it would take me a bit too long to explain what I think a message of this is, that a sense of duty is a very good thing. And one sees that in Vol de Nuit. I mean, Saint-Exupéry is obsessed with duty, in the sense that one becomes greater than oneself by taking on obligations that may be risky to one's life, but by taking them consistently and taking them as something above oneself. But the lamplighter is in a tragic situation where his sense of duty has led him into a kind of absurd situation. So what I would say about him is that part of being free is the ability to sometimes be able to step outside and say, where could my sense of duty be best applied, right? Because the sense of duty, although I agree with Saint-Exupéry that it's a beautiful and a sublime thing, a sense of duty can also lead one into situations that are a bit tragic. And I think that's what I would have said about him if I talked about him.
Thank you. Other questions? Anyone have questions?
Oh, should I start? Thank you so much for coming. I think probably the most compelling character in The Little Prince, in your sort of description of it, was the guy on the asteroid who was very vain, particularly in the way that relates to the sense of sort of disenchantment with the world, such that you can't see the world through other people's eyes. And I think disenchantment is something that like our generation is particularly prone to. And I see that perhaps as connected to the internet as well, particularly with things like social media. One of the ones that you didn't mention was Instagram, which I think is actually hugely impactful. But I guess my question is, like, with such strong cultural forces that are developing and gaining speed and gaining attention and popularity among our generation, like, what is there to be done to overcome those cultural forces that can sometimes seem a little bit, overbearing or, so hegemonic?
I mean, in a way, I was trying to give the answer by giving a lecture. You might have noticed that I didn't have any slides, that it was just me and you, right? It was me and you and a lot of other people, but it was just me and you. There was no other thing that I was trying to get you to look at. I just wanted you to be with me in the story for as long as it lasted. In a way, that's my answer to the question. There was a film about maybe 1992 called Waiting for the End of the World, which was pre-internet as we know it, but which anticipated the addictive capacity of the internet. It's actually a very funny movie. For one thing, the Soviet Union still exists with the internet, which is kind of a great combination. But in the film, the heroine falls prey to this kind of addiction where she's wearing these goggles, and the goggles tell her a story that's all about her, and she can't break away from that story. And the hero's dilemma is to how is he going to finally break her out of this, right? And the way he breaks her out of this is with other forms of art. And I don't have any stronger weapons than the other forms of art, where the other forms of art can be books, or they can be conversation, or they can be planning a trip, right? Or they can be painting. But other forms of art which actually get us into the three-dimensional world with other people. When you say that these are forms of culture that are hegemonic, like the very language worries me, right? Because it suggests that we don't really have much choice. And we do. We do have a lot of control over how much time we spend on the internet. Like a simple decision like, I'm not going to spend more than 2 hours a day can be I've seen that be life-altering. And simple decisions about what order I'm going to go into the internet, as opposed to letting it decide for me. Like I'm not going to show up. I explain how Reddit works and stuff, but generational joke. But making decisions like having your own algorithm as opposed to having it algorithm you. Little things like that, which actually you can do, right? It's actually not hegemonic in that way. But the final thing I'm going to say is that I'm kind of counting on you guys to figure this out, because there's a certain demographic which is highly represented in this room, which will need to have it explained to them, right? So first your generation explained to its grandparents how they could spend the rest of their lives staring at screens. And now we need you to do the opposite. And I mean that, by the way, I'm saying it in a joking way, but I actually mean it totally seriously. The re-enchantment of the physical world, and in particular, I think the re-enchantment of factuality, if you'll forgive me for putting it very bluntly, but the re-sexualization of the factual world, making investigation something which has a real attraction to it. I know young people who are doing this, right? Some of my favorite people, some of my good friends, some of the ones I've learned the most from are 20-somethings who are war reporters, right? Who, by the way, dropped into our election in the summer of 2016 and immediately correctly predicted the result, which I find interesting. But that is where it's going to have to start. It's going to have to be young people who revalorize art and investigation. And I honestly think that's heroic and possibly decisive, and frankly just so much more interesting than staring at the goddamn screen.
Hi, Professor Snyder. Thank you for coming. You just talked about choice in our social media, and I have a question about political choice. Yeah. And on tyranny, your third rule was beware the one-party state. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to hear your perspective on a two-party state. And from what I've seen, it seems that having two parties with such maybe gridlock sometimes, that can really cause apathy, disenchantment, this word thrown around tonight, with people. It could also cloud our creativity to see something beyond two options and trying to move beyond the status quo. And I'd just like you to talk about how we should see our role in a two-party political state.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I can manage it, I'm going to try to write a book about how things could be better. And I very much like the spirit of the question, because so much of American political conversation is about how like it's just the way it is, and like what can you do? And like I think for the time being, one has to like run for office and win elections within the system as it exists. And I think in the time being, like there are basic changes which have to be made by legislation, the most fundamental of which have to do with keeping offshore money out of our politics, which is, really, really directly and indirectly had tremendously negative effects. And also keeping, while we're at it, keeping corporate money out of politics. Sorry guys, it's a bad idea. But in the longer run, we have to ask questions like, why does our system keep generating such implausible candidates for the highest office, right? Because we might agree or disagree about like Mr. Trump and Secretary Clinton and how their various merits, but I think we can generally agree that it's odd that in a country with as fantastically deep an elite as ours has, we can't generate a broader field of interesting candidates. Right? That I find strange, right? There are people in this room who would be better presidents than, I can like pick one out almost at every table, actually, at every table. But the point is like, we're not drawing people to run for office. Part of it has to do with social media, part of it has to do with money. Our elected officials, frankly, should be paid a lot more than they're being paid. Part of it has to do with the way our campaigns are financed. People don't want to run for office because they think, I'll have to spend all my time raising money. If our campaigns were publicly financed and our elected officials were paid more, this would completely sort itself out and different people would run for office. But then, fundamentally, I agree with you. We shouldn't be locked into the two parties that we have. Both of them should feel threatened by the possibility of new parties. I think it would do a lot of, while we're just on the subject and like fantasizing, I think the possibility of having an actual Christian Democratic Party, which would drastically change the way the Republican Party has to think about itself. Christian Democratic in the European sense, like a party which is straightforward about Christian ethics, but at the same time supports a welfare state as part of that ethics. I think that a party like that would clean up in the U.S., frankly, but it's very hard to imagine that right now. Or for the Democrats, like a true Green Party, that would put some, and I think they should have some pressure put on them because not only for our good, but for their own good. Because what we have now is the Democrats have to drift towards the center, and they have to be the ones who are constantly talking about the basic values of the Republic, which is understandable but totally boring. And it goes back to President Boren's remarks earlier about Germany. One thing that goes wrong in Germany is that the main center-left party, the socialists, they have to go to the center and become the defenders of the Constitution, which you feel like you have to do sometimes, but it's really boring, right? It doesn't excite the electorate. Like, we have to save the system, gets old very, very quickly, right? And the Republicans, are off, as I see it anyway, they're way too far off to the right in a way which is troublesome for them. And I think also, for many of them, the ones who talk to me anyway, it's troublesome for them. So I think having more parties would be rather a good thing. But even pushing this further, thinking about democracy in different ways. Like democracy means that there's some chance that you might have to randomly be selected to serve, right? To use that word, right? We only use that word for the military. What if we use that word for city council? What if like being in a city meant that there was some chance that you would have to serve as a city council person, that was just part of it, rather than having everything be elected? So there are ways of thinking about democracy. Like, we call our system democracy, and that there's so many problems with it. And I like your question because I think in the long run we have to be able to think creatively about what a more democratic America would look like. One other argument for all this is that we need more people to vote, right? So, and there's the Electoral College and the gerrymandering and other reasons why people don't vote, not to mention voter suppression laws in 22 American states, which is a bad thing. But that's the negative part. There's also the absence of the positive part, right? Like, people need to be more excited about what's available to them. So.
Any last questions? Yes. Let's take one last question and then we will. Okay. Right there.
On the topic of social media and young people, how well we can organize now with social media, what do you think about the March for Our Lives kids versus the baby boomer anti-Vietnam protests? And do you think that we're going to be successful now, or do you think that it will be worse off because of it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part? We missed the first part of the question on
Okay,
where the
so
mic came on.
On the topic of social media and younger people now becoming involved with politics, I wanted to know what you thought of the differences between the March for Our Lives kids and the anti-Vietnam baby boomer protesters. Do you think that we're going to be more successful now?
I've got all kinds of thoughts about that comparison. Like, for one thing, I personally think there ought to be national service for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one of which is that it makes decisions about whether to fight wars much more honest. You know, in the U.S. now, fighting wars is just a little bit too much like sending other people's kids off to war. You know, it should be a little bit less like that. Also, national service could mean things like educating the whole population in defensive cyber, which I think would be rather a good thing. I mean, by national service, I don't mean, by the way, that everybody has to serve in the military. I just mean some period of life where maybe young people do something together from all over the country. And I mean, it may sound a little bit exotic to some of you, but having defensive cyber as like something that everybody knew about, I think would probably make our country a safer and a better place. That's just about the comparison, right? Because like the difference between Vietnam era and now is that we now have a professional military, and then we had a draft, and the existence of the draft changes the situation drastically. But I want to focus in on Parkland. There are two things at least that are very important about this. The first is that in mobilization, it's now we're talking about On Tyranny, I write about this in that book, it's very important to be working on an issue and talking about an issue where you have a personal stake that's easy to explain. And school shootings are that. Right? I mean, not just for those kids, but for anybody who goes through schools, or anybody who has kids in schools, right? I mean, my kids have to drill for shootings, you know, and they're 8 and 5. This is an issue which is pretty easy, you know, to convey the significance of, because it's pretty easy to tell a story which is not a partisan story about. The second thing which is important about Parkland, even though it might not immediately seem so important, is the marching part. The marching part is really important because the marching part says we're willing to take a little bit of risk, we're willing to be together, we're willing to move to some other kind of a place. And marching is a gateway to other forms of political activity. So that's something which is very, very positive. Do you win? It's not going to be enough to win, right? I mean, trying to stop the Vietnam War is a very different kind of issue than trying to get legislation about gun control. But you only win, and it seems like a lot of these kids understand this, you only win if you keep going, and you keep being interesting, and you keep having high numbers. And then here's the sneaky thing. You also have to start winning elections. But I mean, it makes me feel, that reaction makes me feel better. And by the way, it confirms where I wanted to end this lecture, which is the importance of the humanities. Those kids go to a good public school, and what are they? They are theater kids. They are kids who've been educated precisely in the arts, and as a result, they're able to communicate with others, and they're able to imagine a world which is slightly different than the world that we're actually living in. Right? So, I mean, in that sense, they're a very good example of the point that I was trying to make.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Timothy Snyder for being here with us tonight. Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask Sky Singleton if she would come forward now. Sky is an OU graduate student from Norman. She's, as an undergraduate, she was named as the Outstanding Senior for the School of Music. She's performed internationally, has been soloist for numerous performances with the OU Chorale, and she graduated from OU with special distinction in voice performance, a recipient of the Marilyn Horn Award. She's currently pursuing her master's degree in voice, and it's been a real pleasure to have her go with me, to go to recruitment dinners, to be at so many special university events together as we join together with really an admonition to all of us to make sure that we have this university live on stronger, broader, and deeper than ever before, as we've heard tonight. So Sky, please all stand and let's sing the OU chant together.
O-K-L-A-H-O-M-A, our chant rolls on and on. Thousands strong join heart and song in alma mater's praise. Of campus beautiful by day and night, of colors proudly gleaming red and white, 'neath a western sky, OU's chant will never die. Live on, university.
Thank you for coming.